Hello, everybody, and welcome to our crash course for business communications. In this crash course, we are going to go through each of the 19 chapters that are assigned in the syllabus for this textbook. A link to where you can get the textbook or where you can see the textbook is included in the course syllabus, but we're going to kind of go through the main points that are going to be necessary, and then we're going to finish off at the end with a video on the assignments that are established for this course. So first we're going to look at Chapter 1. Chapter 1 is about the importance of communication, what communication is. Later chapters will get to how to best communicate. The first is the idea that communication is important for your career, pretty much no matter what you're doing. Maybe not everything, but in virtually all things that you do, communication is going to be important because you're going to have to communicate with people inside and outside your organization. If you're an employee, you're dealing with people who are below you and people who are above you. If you're an executive, you're dealing with many, many people who are below you directly or indirectly. Consultant, which means somebody who's hired, or freelancer, really are both situations in which somebody is hired for a temporary or individual job, are situations in which you're going to have to communicate with your clients. Communication may be especially important for those kinds of employees because you have to convince the people who hired you that your services are actually worth it. An entrepreneur is somebody who starts his or her own business, and communicating with clients, communicating with vendors, communicating with other people is, of course, an extremely important component of running your own business. Communication, in fact, may be the single most important thing that's relevant when somebody's starting a business. You can produce a product, but if you can't convince people to buy it or to use it, or convince people to work with you who can produce things that you need, the idea or the product is pretty much useless. Information sharing is an interesting topic. Now this, let me zoom in a little bit over here. There we go. Here are some examples of how communication can kind of go awry a little bit, or maybe not be as smooth as you would think. If you say, for example, the new app is on schedule, so then you're trying to tell the other person that everything is good. On the other hand, if you go in the bottom where I think everything is fine, then you're kind of impliedly, sometimes people don't look at specifically what you say, but they make implications or inferences from what you're saying. In the middle over here, we've got kind of in between a transmitted meaning, which means when what you say is exactly what you mean, and a recreated meaning which applies when what you say is really not what you mean, to kind of in the middle where you have a negotiated meeting where you say everything is fine and the other person says, well, is there anything you're worried about? And then you kind of hedge your bet a little bit and say, there are two people quit, but I'm trying to replace them. And so, the other person is now kind of aware that you're hedging your bet a little bit, which is fine. Again, there's nothing inherently wrong with any of these types of communications, but you need to be aware when you do communicate that you're not always going to have what you say and what you mean and what the other person infers from what you say are not always going to be the exact same thing. What can communication do? It, of course, can build trust. It's necessary. Without communication, there's no way that the other person will understand or appreciate what you're doing. Closer ties to the community. Again, that really means communication outside of your business, communication with clients, productivity, marketing, sales, employee relations. All of these things are critical to any company, and communication necessary for all of them, for fairly obvious reasons. When you market, you need to communicate to the world why your good or service is important. What are the general, again, these are all things that are very, very general and are covered in more specifics as we move along in the course, but what makes business communication more effective? Well, number one, giving facts rather than vague communications. Our sales are up 68% this year is a lot more effective than saying our sales are up a lot, or our sales are up 5%, maybe, which is not maybe as good as 68%, but it's certainly something that's more specific than saying we're having a good year or sales are up. Sales are up doesn't really mean much. It could mean 68 or 5. Being clear is important. Clarifying expectations and responsibilities. Again, these are all things, of course, that are critical aspects of communication and critical functions of communication to try to clarify what it is you're expecting of your client or your employee. And, of course, to be persuasive. Communication very often is trying to convince somebody of something, the customer to buy, the vendor to give you a discount, your supervisor to give you a raise, or your supervisor to do things your way, or somebody to give you a job. These are all things that are important for business communication, and being persuasive and making good arguments is, of course, critical. Professionalism is a catch-all word that's used to imply many different aspects of business and business communication. If you ask somebody what does professionalism mean, you'll get very different answers depending on who you ask and when you ask. But here are some examples of things that are sometimes included in the term professionalism: striving to get better and excel, being dependable. Then accountable means, uh, are you going to stand behind your product, or are you going to blame somebody else? If you're a supervisor and your underling does something wrong, are you going to blame it on your underling, or are you going to take responsibility as the supervisor? Being a team player means not necessarily doing everything for your own credit, but for the company. Demonstrating a sense of etiquette, which means not doing things that are offensive to people. Different people and different cultures may have different sense of etiquettes, and being sensitive to everybody's the way people look at things is important. Making ethical decisions, maintaining positive outlook, all of these things are sometimes referred to as parts of professionalism. What do people expect of you? When you're hired in a white collar position or profession, what are generally your supervisors and your coworkers going to expect of you? First of all, people expect you to be fluent in digital information. They expect you to be able to look things up on the internet, understand what they are, understand what is reliable, what's not reliable. If you tell somebody, I know for a fact that it's true because I saw it on Wikipedia, that is going to cause people to question your digital fluency. Your ability to organize ideas rather than to just simply float along and meander along, but the ability to explain things to people in the order in which they are relevant, from more general to more specific, not necessarily to say things in completely random orders. The ability to express ideas concisely, coherently, and persuasively. This is more a matter of writing than it is a manner of speaking. Concisely means making sure that when you write something in a manner sufficient to convey the idea without being overly wordy. Obviously, when you're speaking, things are a lot different than writing. There is a lot more of a license to be verbose when you're speaking than when you're writing, because you can't edit what you say. What you say is what it is. When you write, you can edit what you write to make it more concise. Active listening skills, which means drawing from the speaker what it is you want to know from the speaker. Active listening skills are asking questions about what the speaker said, clarifying what the speaker said, trying to clarify what the speaker said, and communication skills with people from diverse backgrounds. That's part of etiquette. That's part of understanding how to deal with people from different, not necessarily from different cultures, but different backgrounds, different people that are coming from different places, etc. Continuing this list, effective use of communication technologies. That, of course, means speaking. That means writing primarily, email, even text, memoranda, reports, all things that are important. High quality writing and speaking standards. These are all things that people expect of you if you any kind of a white collar job, whether you're a secretary or the chief executive officer of a company. You're going to need these skills. Obviously, there'll be different levels. The CEO is expected to have a higher level of communication ability than the secretary, but if no matter what white collar job you work for, you are going to be expected to have at least some level of these skills, and if you don't, you're probably not going to have that job for very long. Maintaining business etiquette, communicating ethically, this is kind of what we discussed before as well, and time management. I couldn't meet the deadline. Sometimes it's impossible to meet a deadline. Sometimes deadlines are unrealistic. But just to say I got busy and I couldn't do what you asked me to do in the context of an office may indicate a lack of time management skills. You're expected to be able to budget your time, and just I didn't have time or I'm late because I didn't have time to do it, that's not necessarily a good enough excuse. Although, of course, sometimes it may just not be possible. Now we're going to continue with the rest of the chapter, kind of expounding a little bit on what we already discussed. Communicating in an organizational context. This is just an example, of course. This is not the template that applies to all organizations, but you might have a president, various vice presidents under him or her. Marketing might supervise somebody who's in sales, and somebody who is in promotion. This is just an example, and of course, communication applies through everybody. President has to communicate with everybody. The vice presidents have to communicate with the people underneath them. There's downward communication, which means from supervisor to supervised. There is upwards communications, which is the opposite. There is Horizontal communications, which means communications between people on the same level, all of them are important, some with slightly different manners, but they're all, of course, very important. Some of the tips, and again, a lot of these are for the rest of the chapter are going to be tips on how to improve your ability to do these types of communications. Focus on the you attitude, which means making sure that what you're saying applies to the audience to whom you're saying it. If it's your underlings, a little bit of a pep talk about how good a job they're doing might be appropriate. If it's your supervisor, telling your supervisor you're doing a great job, it doesn't mean you should never praise your supervisor, but it may come off as sounding a little trite, a little brown nosy, so to speak. But what is also, how are you going to tailor your message to your audience? Are the people you're speaking to well educated? Do they have come to it from political socioeconomic background? These are all things that are important to consider whenever you're writing an email or message. Who am I writing to? Who is this designed for? Is this the sort of message that is going to resonate with them dramatically? Here's an example of a business communication process, kind of a flow chart of how things work. You have an idea. Okay, now you got to encode that idea in the message. Encoding could be in an email, it could be in a text, it could be in pretty much any medium. Then you send it through the channel. That's important. By the way, figuring out your medium might be important. Is this the sort of thing that should be done over a phone call, or is this the sort of thing that should be done over an email? Email has the advantage that you can edit it before you send it. You can think about it. Sometimes if it's a difficult email to send or complicated or nasty or anything like that, you might want to write it and take a few hours or even a few days to get some perspective on it before you send it. All those things can be done in an email. None of those things can be done on the phone. On the other hand, in a phone conversation or a personal conversation, of course, it's much easier to get instant feedback and to see how your message is going across. Can the person ask you for clarification? Asking for clarification in an email is not so easy. Yeah, you can send emails back and forth. It could be hours before they're answered back and forth. There are different advantages, but you've got to figure out a channel. Then you've got to send it. It could be something simple. It doesn't have to be complicated. It could be a text. It could be anything pretty much. The audience receives the message, and then the audience decodes the message. What do I mean by decoding? Decoding means the audience interprets the message. Is my supervisor annoyed with me? Is this person telling me what to do in the future, or is it just a one-time thing? You have to realize that the person who gets your message is perhaps not going to interpret it precisely as you said it or precisely as you meant it. These are all elements to think about before making a business communication. Business communication with somebody you work with every day, maybe you may not have to be as careful with. If it's somebody you barely see or somebody you communicate with once a week, you may want to put more thought into your communications. And then, of course, the audience can provide feedback to the sender. This is how I interpret it. It may not be in those words, but when they respond to you, you'll get a better sense of how your message was interpreted. What are some things that prevent or stop or get in the way of business communication? Noise and distractions, again, that could usually, you're talking about oral conversations, but also could be, email chains that go off on tangents, competing messages, maybe different people in the business send the same person messages that contradict each other or are not entirely consistent. Maybe you send messages to people that are not entirely consistent with each other. Filters, maybe is this being communicated by a third party? And does that third party, if I'm the president of the company, I may say something to the vice president. Vice president turns around and says it to the head of marketing. The head of marketing says it to the people who are the actual marketers. Well, the message may come from the president, but in the meantime, it's gone through three different iterations, and it may be very different. Like in a game of telephone, where what the first person said is not necessarily the same thing as what the eighth person said. Are there filters? Is it a good idea to go communicate directly with the people that you're speaking to, or is it better idea to have the supervisors go through channels and you speak to the person you supervise, etc., etc. Okay. Um, I, how you look at the audience, of course, how the audience receives the message is important, and how the audience decodes the message. We've already discussed this a little bit, but these are things that you need to look at for future reference when it does happen, and think about before you send the message. So when you do establish your communication or start the communication, you need to consider certain things. What does the audience expect? Is the audience expecting you to criticize, or is the audience expecting you to give advice? When the audience could be somebody who works under you, is the audience, or is the audience your customer base? Is the audience your the people who you're dealing with on a business level? These are all things that you need, of course, to consider. And then, of course, when once the audience does get the message, again, whether they be people who you work with or your client base or whatever it is, what are they going to use? What factors are going to be important in how they interpret and decode your message? Perception. How do they perceive your message? Selective perception means, they might perceive things how they want to perceive them. If they want to be offended or they want to be angry, they may perceive your message as being more angry than it actually is. They'll also, of course, use their own personal and cultural belief systems or cultures, the way people communicate in the culture. Some cultures may be more free thinking or may be more subject to authority. Cultures that have put a very high emphasis on obeying orders may react to a suggestion from an underling more than cultures who emphasize teamwork and who emphasize free thinking ability. The United States in general, we emphasize things like free thinking and free suggestion a little bit more than some other cultures who may emphasize things like following orders a little bit more. So it's the sort of thing you have to consider when you establish your communication. And finally, in this section, we're going to look at how the audiences respond to messages. They might not respond at all. You might motivate them to respond. For example, you might say any suggestions are welcome, or if it's a customer base or a mass message, you might actually attach a survey. You can use a survey site like SurveyMonkey or something like that, or an internal survey mechanism to say, what do you think of this, and see how people respond. The audience, of course, isn't going to need to remember and understand the message in order to be able to respond appropriately. Okay. Again, here's just some example of some. We don't need to go into this. This is just some ideas of how communication is established. Now I want to move to mobile communications. Now, mobile communications simply means something that is a little bit less formal than something like a telephone communication or an in-person communication or even an email. Mobile communications refers to things that are done very quickly. Now, an email could be a mobile communication. I guess when you're emailing somebody from your mobile device, by definition, it's a mobile communication. But the idea is that mobile communications such as text messages, WhatsApp messages, short emails from the road, things like that, you have to have a little bit of a different expectation of from mobile communications than you do from longer form communications. 80% of internet users access the web with a mobile device. I've seen in terms of people watching videos that we post, sometimes we've seen that 90% of the people that watch videos on sites like YouTube or Vimeo are watching them from mobile devices rather than from laptops. So, and this is especially true with younger people, with the quote-unquote millennial generation. Their mobile devices are considered par for the course. So you have to go in with a different expectation when you're dealing with people who are going to be communicating from their mobile device. They're going to be less informal. They're going to be shorter. That doesn't mean that you should communicate in that way necessarily. And certainly, if something is very important or very complex, or a report, is probably a better idea to sit down at your computer and write a well-crafted, well-thought-out email, or have an in-person or telephone communication, but still the expectations have to be a little bit different. More email messages are now open in mobile devices. Again, the idea here is, I think we can dispense with all the statistics and just realize that mobile communications, short communications, quick communications are at a tremendous premium today, more so than ever. What are some of the things that we have to watch out for because of this communication? First of all, everybody's constantly connected, which means that people can respond to you on Sunday morning at 6 o'clock. People can email back and forth, whereas in the old days, people would never communicate with each other in work until they got to work on Monday morning at 9:30 or whatever it is. People are constantly connected, even if they're not at work. Communications can shoot back and forth very quickly. There are small mobile displays. People may make typographical errors. People may misinterpret things, especially when you're talking about videos or charts or anything like that. Mobile users are multitasking. Realize that when somebody is with their kids at the park and they're texting back and forth on a business issue, it's considered, generally speaking, acceptable to do that sort of thing, unless it's, extremely a sensitive issue. Just realize that they might be watching their kids at the same time and might be not necessarily putting in the same level of thought as they otherwise would. Changes in traditional grammar, we've all seen that, where people write the letter U instead of YOU. Is that appropriate? Well, it depends. If it's somebody you communicate with 100 times a day and you go back and forth and it's expected, not that big a deal. If you're writing to the CEO of your company and it's somebody that you don't communicate with normally and it's somebody who you want to impress, then writing the letter U instead of YOU is a very unimpressive thing to do, and it's not really a very good idea. Sensory and cognitive extensions of the user, a mobile device is much more so an extension of the user than is a laptop or a PC. You use your phone perhaps without necessarily thinking about it, kind of as a knee-jerk thing, much more so than business communications used to be done. Why are mobile technologies important? First of all, security and privacy concerns. People can be connected on Wi-Fi signals at Starbucks, which are not that secure. People can see you're sitting on a park bench. Other people might be looking over your shoulder, whereas if you're in your office, people are generally not looking over your shoulder, hopefully. But on the other hand, you could have enhanced productivity because it makes communication a lot easier. There are also business-specific apps, and again, here when I talk about mobile devices, I'm talking about phones, but I'm also talking about tablets. And the distinction between a computer and a tablet is now smaller than ever, where you have computers that can be a desktop when you're sitting at your desk, and then you pick it up and it functions like a tablet when you're out. So the distinction between mobile, as we move further and further, the distinction between a mobile app and a desktop app is shrinking. But still, there's a chance for more engagement, a chance for more productivity, a chance for more collaboration, because communication is so easy. How do you use technology to improve business communication? Well, we'll discuss this, but also let's take a look at some of the pros and cons of technology. Some of the pros, well, obviously, mobile apps are very useful tools for very quick communication. It enhances the communication process. It assists in accomplishment with tasks because now you can communicate very easily, whereas a message that you sent in 3 minutes, having to go back to your computer and write an email might take 10 minutes or more. Can't think for you. Can fill in the skills gaps if you don't know how to do something or how to frame something or how to communicate something. It really a mobile device can't really help you. And of course, it's not a replacement for communication, just a medium for communication. All that is pretty obvious. You do want to guard against information overload, which means having so much communication back and forth that you're kind of obscuring the message. You want to make sure that, for example, manage subscriptions. If you're, again, WhatsApp is very often a social thing rather than a business thing, but you don't want to necessarily be part of 1,000 different groups and you have notifications on, and every 3 seconds you're sitting there and you get a little beep and you're totally distracted the whole day because you're seeing everybody, you're seeing everything, and that of course decreases productivity, not increases. When you're sitting there at work and your phone is beeping every 5 minutes because you got another post to some random WhatsApp thread that you're subscribed to, that obviously can decrease your productivity. So filtering features doesn't just mean physical, it doesn't mean filtering features in your device, it also means filtering features in terms of what you prioritize. Do you have to look every single time somebody posts to your, you get a message from Facebook, somebody posted to, his own timeline or something, so do you have to go check it? Well, that's not necessarily such a good idea. Maybe you should desubscribe to some of these things, especially if you're at work. If you're at home and you're doing nothing, then, maybe that's not such a big deal, but if you're at work, you may want to not get notified every time anybody posts to anything relevant to you on Facebook or WhatsApp or text or anything like that. Avoid sending unnecessary messages, and of course, mark and save important messages for later on. If you're sitting there zoning out, it's late at night, and you're sitting there on your couch just relaxing, you see you get an email, well, mark it, flag it. You can flag it from your phone, and the next day when you're at work, you can deal with it. It doesn't mean you have to deal with it 11 o'clock at night when you're tired. It could be a sensitive thing. It may not be a good idea to deal with a sensitive thing at 11 o'clock at night when you're on your couch. It may be a good idea just to flag it, and tomorrow you can deal with it. That's probably the better idea, actually. Okay, training staff, training the people that you're dealing with, training the people that you're supervisor of, explaining that all these things are done are, of course, are very important. And, of course, connecting with individual people can help. You don't want your communication to be entirely through social media and entirely through text. You want things to be also by phone. And you want to use technology as an aid, not a replacement for communication. Nothing can really, even though it's great that you can communicate with people so easily, nothing really replaces a face-to-face meeting every once in a while to kind of put a face with the voice and to really allow the person with whom you're communicating to know you. And the last section of this chapter deals with ethics and ethical dilemmas. Again, this will be covered in much more detail, but you want communication to, of course, be true and not deceptive. You don't want to plagiarize. Plagiarizing means taking somebody else's work and passing it off as your own. You can say, John told me this, that's perfectly fine, or I saw this in an article, and you can quote the article, nothing wrong with that. That's good, as a matter of fact. But you don't want to take somebody else's idea and pass it off as your own. Omitting important information or selective quoting, essentially. Selective quoting or selective misquoting means taking something out of context. Like, it would be a really bad idea if we would increase our sales force by 100. And then someone else writes, you said increase your sales force by 100. That's obviously, taking things out of context. There are less egregious examples, but it's certainly pretty easy to do that in today's day and age where, you can take one paragraph or one sentence out of a 200-word email and take it out of context. You don't want to do that. Misrepresenting numbers, distorting visuals, this means just distorting graphics, and failing to respect privacy or security are all ethical problems, or all ethical things that are obviously no-nos. Ethical communication implies or relies on the people being ethical, the company leadership being ethical, and there being appropriate structures in place. In other words, not only should the people in the company be ethical, but there should be a statement in the company policy. It should be official company policy that these things should be done in an ethical manner, which is why many companies have codes of conduct. It may take a while to write, but if you have a pretty big company, having a statement that clearly tells employees what is expected of them, of course, are very important. And of course, making sure that things are legal, to avoid false advertising, not breaching contracts. There are all sorts. These are all based on law. Not defaming people. There are false advertising requirements, transparency requirements. These are, again, more common in commercial areas and securities areas, but they're certainly relevant to everybody. So thanks for listening to Chapter 1. We'll see you in Chapter 2.